so what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on Boris Johnson running away, just for a change, this time from his latest scandal about the COVID inquiry. And it isn't even over what he did or said or knew, but about whether the COVID inquiry is allowed to know what he did or said or knew. And most importantly, to whom he said it. Now, Jason, take us through this, because it's a very complicated row about the process and powers of a statutory inquiry, which, as I understand it, has very broad powers to ask for whatever evidence it damn well pleases. Why are they even arguing about it?
Because there's obviously something very embarrassing or difficult or nasty in these WhatsApp messages, which the government doesn't want released. It's really confusing how they've got to this situation. So COVID inquiry, quite understandably, the chair, Baroness Hallett, has requested the private WhatsApp messages between ministers and officials. The Cabinet Office has then said you can't have some of them because some of them, and this is a quote, are unambiguously irrelevant. Why they decide this and not the COVID inquiry decides what's relevant and what isn't is a question for itself. Then they suddenly, the Cabinet Office has said that they actually don't have this information anyway. How they had it at one point to decide it wasn't relevant, and then they don't have it, nobody quite knows. Maybe like Rebecca Vardy's phone, it's been dropped in the North Sea. Who knows? Yeah. And then just to make it even more complicated, Boris Johnson, and we know from Boris Johnson he may not always be trustworthy. I'm putting it as politely as possible.
Really?
Yeah. I know, shocking news, but we need to bear that in mind. He's indicated that he's actually willing to hand over messages himself if he was asked. Bookmark that one, Susie. We have no idea if that's going to happen or not. Yeah. So that's the kind of where we are. We've got a standoff. The COVID inquiry is given until tomorrow evening. That's a 24-hour extension on or 48-hour extension on what they previously had to hand over this information. The Cabinet Office is threatening legal action to block this information, which means it could end up in a massive court row, which would delay the COVID inquiry. And who would benefit from delaying the COVID inquiry, Susie? The government, because this information would come out after the election.
Exactly. Everybody in government, but nobody who's not in government, who would quite like to hear some answers. This is very interesting. What do you think, everybody? Why is Boris Johnson offering to hand this over? Why is he not handed it over already? Why is the Cabinet Office blocking it? Who knows? We perhaps find out in the course of this. So Mike says, why would Johnson and the Cabinet Office go to so much trouble to cover mere embarrassment by something by Johnson? If he called Matt Hancock a bad word, nobody would mind. Many would agree. There must be something very damaging for Johnson and or Sunak in those messages. It's true, isn't it, Jason? Because as soon as anybody says, it's not just journalists who get this, but as soon as anybody says, no, you can't see that, everyone goes, oh, hello. There's lots here then, isn't there? And even if, for example, there's a WhatsApp about Boris and Carrie's shopping list, okay, and the lawyers or the Cabinet Office say, well, that's clearly irrelevant. It's got nothing to do with the COVID inquiry. If there's something on that shopping list that says, I don't know, hand gel, disinfectant hand gel, before we were all told to use disinfectant hand gel, then, I mean, it is relevant suddenly. That's why statutory inquiries have really broad powers. It's because, you know, these things can be stuff that appears irrelevant to other people, but that's where the cover-up almost comes in, isn't it? And it's the cover-up that catches them out every time, not actually the thing that they did, usually. So go on, Jace.
No, I was just going to say the Hancock is incredibly relevant here because of his COVID diaries, which the hundreds of messages got selectively leaked to the Telegraph. We don't know if the Telegraph published all of them, by the way, which is quite an important fact. There is a precedent now that if some of this information is already out in the public domain, then the COVID inquiry, and more importantly, and we'll come on to this, the bereaved relatives of those who died from the coronavirus, they have a right, I think, to know all this information, not just a partial release of it. And I don't think it's fair on people who lost loved ones that we can have the selective divulgence of information in this way. And I think that's important. And there's a quote in the Mirror today from somebody called Becky Cumner, who's part of the kind of the bereaved families groups, who very poignantly says, "I was WhatsApping my dad the final messages to him." And you think, the people who are blocking the release of information should just think, just for a small time, just a little bit, about how this must be perceived by those who are unable to be with their loved ones at the time, and how important it is to them that they get to the actual truth of what happened.
Yeah. Now, Anne-Marie says they don't want the people to know the truth about their incompetence in not acting sooner or responsibly from start to finish during the global pandemic. That certainly raises that kind of suspicion, doesn't it, Anne-Marie? So Boris Johnson, from what I can tell, Boris Johnson provided these diaries and WhatsApps to his lawyers, who told the Cabinet Office that much of it was irrelevant and personal, and then he fired his lawyers. So the Cabinet Office has been telling the inquiry chair, Baroness Hallett, that she can't have it because it's irrelevant, but it hasn't actually got them itself to check this at all. So she's now demanding they hand it over, and they haven't got it in order to hand it over. So Johnson has a new set of lawyers, also funded by us, which have started combing through it, and they can make it available to Hallett. But that's going to take some time. It's all going to take longer, and set the whole inquiry timetable back a bit, perhaps a bit further past the next general election. And I'd have thought, as there is plainly a lot of red meat in there, Hallett is just going to, the next stage is just that Hallett would go to war with the lawyers and ask them to give it all to her team so she can assess it herself. I mean, that's what's going to happen. They can't really refuse if she says to the lawyers, give me the WhatsApps or else.
And this is a key thing. It should be for the inquiry to decide what is relevant and not relevant. It shouldn't be for officials or politicians. I mean, the Cabinet Office shouldn't be able to judge whether something is unambiguously irrelevant or not. They're not in that position. But the COVID inquiry is perfectly capable of distinguishing, as you said, between a shopping list for nappies and a shopping list for 25 million pounds worth of PPE from a Tory donor. they can do this. That's in their gift. And if some of these WhatsApp messages are just gossip or joshing, that's not going to be relevant to the inquiry anyway, so they won't be used. But it's not for the politicians to just make this decision.
No. And Jackie says, do the government actually believe the people are stupid? We are dog-tired of cover-ups. Enough already. Yes, they do think you're stupid, Jackie, and they think that you will have forgotten about it and moved on to something else by the time you get to the ballot box. That is how they have always operated, regardless of party and power, pretty much, in this country. Now, the Cabinet Office is sort of, if you don't know, it's sort of like the Prime Minister's department, I suppose. It's like the beating heart of government. It kind of authorises pretty much everything that goes on. It's got bigger and bigger over the years. It's unwieldy, it's bureaucratic. And when I've had dealings with it over the nuclear weapons, nuclear test veterans story that I do, it's even more obtuse sometimes than the MOD, which is going some. But there are some now, Jason, saying that, on the one hand, the Cabinet Office is politically inept, run by an idiot who's doing lots of silly things. And there are others saying, but it's not just Boris Johnson's WhatsApps that we're talking about. It's who WhatsApped him, which includes and will include the current Prime Minister, current ministers of government, and Simon Case, the current head of the civil service and permanent secretary at the Cabinet Office. So is this kind of, Boris is sucking all the oxygen out of the room like normal, but is this actually trying to stop the WhatsApps of associated people and using Boris as a bit of cover?
I think there's an element of that. I mean, in some ways, the behaviour of Boris Johnson is this kind of muddying an already complicated picture. As always with Boris Johnson, he'll be doing what is best for him and what is to his advantage. That's how he's always operated. But you raise a kind of a much more important point, which is how much do we know about what goes on in government? And even somebody who's covered the kind of Parliament in Westminster for more than a quarter of a century, we actually know very, very little. I remember one very, very senior number 10 official once telling me that journalists probably know about 10% what goes on and 90% is kept hidden. And so it's kind of like, this is a very rare opportunity to get under the bonnet of the machinery of government and see how very messy and how badly wired and how greasy the whole operation is. I can understand the reluctance, because obviously, you know, if you see how sausages are made, you never want to eat another sausage. But the problem for them, and I don't think they realised this at the time, is that the Matt Hancock, he made a precedent by releasing all this information, inadvertently or not. Yeah, we now know that these documents, a lot of these documents are out there, and therefore there is an incredible duty on them to give the relatives and the public the complete picture, not just a partial picture.
Yeah. Okay. Now we're going to move on to Phil and Holly next, but I just want to say one last thing. Some of the stuff that's been withheld so far is Boris Johnson's personal diaries that he kept during the COVID crisis. Apparently there's 24 of them, which as far as I can tell is a book a month, which he couldn't possibly be sitting on that for, you know, perhaps to write his own COVID diaries after all this. Could he, Jason, perhaps protect his exclusive?
I mean, you know, how did he find time to do this? It's quite a mystery. But
he's WhatsApping 1 minute and writing his diaries for his future book deal the next.
Was he ever running the country at all, or was he too busy?
No one saw any evidence of it, did they? That may explain an awful lot, of course. Maybe one of the things Baroness Hallett wants to look at.